Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The U.S. Congress, A Very Short Introduction, by Donald A. Ritchie, narrated by Runnette. Preface. Taking its name from the Latin for coming together, Congress is the place where elected officials from all parts of the United States converge to govern. That coming together can be heard in the many regional accents of its members in debate, their constant references to their home states, and their efforts to protect and promote constituent views and interests in the legislation they enact. But Congress really does not exist as an institution. The term encompasses both the Senate and the House of Representatives, each operating under different rules and in different atmospheres. Each has its own leadership and its own side of the Capitol building, where most room numbers are prefixed with either H or S. The House and Senate must each pass bills in precisely the same language to send them to the President, and each needs a two-thirds vote to override a veto. They meet jointly to hear the President's State of the Union message, and they hold conference committees to work out differences in the bills they have passed, but otherwise each has little to do with the other body. Representatives are also called congressmen and congresswomen, while senators are always senators. But it is misleading to refer to the House alone as Congress, and there is no Speaker of Congress. When the Constitution says that Congress shall have the power to, or Congress may by law, or the consent of Congress, it gives that power and responsibility jointly to the House and Senate. Neither body can make a law or appropriate funds on its own. The term Congress also refers to the legislative sessions conducted during the 2 years between congressional elections. A Congress is generally divided into 2 sessions, one each year. Occasional emergencies have required a third session of a Congress. Under the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, since 1934, sessions of Congress begin on January 3rd, although the date may vary according to legislative needs. This very short introduction, like all studies of the national legislature, uses Congress to identify the two houses together, while regularly drawing distinctions between the rules, powers, and personalities of the House and Senate. Although I spent my whole professional career on Capitol Hill, I intend the book to be neither a defense nor an apology, but an analysis of how Congress works, how it has changed, and how it relates to the voters, the states, and the other branches of the federal government. This book highlights in condensed form the precedents and practices of the House and Senate, examines how their committees handle legislative business, and observes how their floor proceedings operate to produce laws. It weighs the competition between the legislative branch and the executive and judiciary. The Constitution did not so much divide power between these branches as it forced them to share it, each wanting a larger share. In this struggle, the House and Senate have retained their original constitutional construction and powers, while contending with an executive that has grown exponentially in size, influence, and power. Any understanding of Congress will also require a discussion of how members get elected, what it takes to get re-elected, and the nature of representation. A central theme is the historic need for compromise to move legislation forward, countered by the increasing polarization of American political parties that has made compromise so much harder to achieve. Finally, the Capitol provides such an imposing physical setting for Congress and houses so diverse a cast of characters that this survey will conclude with a group portrait, a snapshot, really, of Capitol Hill. Based on political history and political science, this book is essentially a tour of Capitol Hill that along the way will point out many of the players, the reasons behind their legislative behavior, the meaning of their parliamentary language, and the evolution of their practices. A good tour should be entertaining as well as educational, incorporating humor and irony without resorting to cynicism, and like any tour, there will not be opportunity to learn about everything. so it will focus on a few examples, processes, events, and locations, and allude to others. Chapter 1. The Great Compromise. Appropriately, Congress began with a compromise. Meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, the Constitutional Convention crafted a federal government divided into legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and further divided Congress into two houses, believing that a separation of powers would serve as a check against potential tyranny, including the tyranny of a political majority. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, James Madison reasoned, anticipating that each branch would guard its own prerogatives jealously, preventing an undue concentration of power. But a standoff developed over the issue of representation in the legislature. Delegates from the larger states wanted both houses of the Congress to reflect the size of a state's population. More people deserved more representation. The smaller states refused to accept any government in which they were not equal to the larger ones. At this impasse, the convention recessed for the July 4th celebration and appointed a committee to find a solution. The committee split the difference in the Great Compromise, which set proportional representation in the House of Representatives and equality of the states in the Senate. State delegations in the House would vary in size, while every state would have 2 senators, Article 1, Sections 2 and 3. No state would lose its equal standing in the Senate without its consent, which none would ever give. There remained other issues to settle, most significantly how to count enslaved African Americans for purposes of representation and taxation, but without the Great Compromise the rest of the Constitution would have been moot. What kind of legislative bodies did the Great Compromise create? After the 2020 census, California, the largest state with nearly 40 million residents, sent 52 members to the House. The 590,000 residents of Wyoming, by contrast, rate only a single representative, yet Wyoming and California both elect 2 senators. This lopsided equation gives states with small populations a big advantage in the Senate. The 10 states containing half the people in the United States are represented by 239 of the 435 members of the House, but only 20 senators. The 40 states with the other half of the population have 80 senators. The Constitution set a minimum of 30,000 inhabitants in each congressional district, but no maximum. After each census every 10 years, the House is reapportioned to reflect changes in population. Beginning with 65 members, it grew steadily until it reached 435 after the 1910 census. The House chamber became so crowded that the members' desks had to be replaced with theater seating. Concerned that anything larger would make the legislative process unwieldy, Congress capped House membership at 435. After every census, some states would then gain seats, and others lose them. For years, rural districts fought to prevent losing representatives, which resulted in a great disparity in district size. The longtime House Speaker Sam Rayburn, Democrat, Texas, for instance, had only a third as many people in his rural district as did the representative from Dallas. Not until 1964 did the Supreme Court apply a one-person, one-vote standard to House reapportionment, requiring districts with equal numbers of inhabitants. Each House of Congress can write its own rules, and the two bodies have evolved differently to accommodate their dissimilar representation. Since the late 19th century, the larger House has adopted rules that allowed the majority party to prevail, so long as its members hold together when they vote. The Senate's rules gave greater voice to the minority, whether the minority party, a fraction of the majority party, or even a single senator. The House grew hierarchical, while the Senate became a body of equals. Despite their vast differences, however, no bill can become law until both houses pass it with exactly the same wording, down to the last semicolon. Why not a parliament? Some of the ideas discarded at the Constitutional Convention might have created a legislative branch closer to a parliament, where the Prime Minister and Cabinet Secretaries are members of the legislature. Congress might have elected presidents and might have been able to remove them for maladministration, provisions that could have turned the presidency into something closer to a prime minister, with tenure dependent on retaining the majority in Congress. There were even suggestions that senators serve for life at no pay, making the Senate a House of Lords, with the House of Representatives as the House of Commons. Nevertheless, Congress did follow the British Parliament's bicameral model. For more than a century, colonial legislatures had generally been divided between an upper house, or governor's council, and a popularly elected assembly. During the American Revolution, some of the states abolished their upper houses, regarding single-body legislatures as more egalitarian. The Continental Congress and the Congress under the Articles of Confederation were also single bodies. Property holders, however, worried that unchecked democratic legislatures would turn confiscatory, and that way of thinking added extra layers to the Constitution. Whereas representatives would be directly elected by people, senators initially would be elected by the state legislatures, and the Electoral College would choose the president, forming a mixed government to prevent an excess of democracy. The U.S. government distinctly differs from parliamentary democracies. Neither the president nor the cabinet secretaries sit in Congress, and no member of any branch can serve simultaneously in another, except for the vice president, whom the Constitution installed as a president of the Senate to keep occupied until and unless needed to fill a vacancy in the presidency. Unlike prime ministers, American presidents do not lose office if their party's majority falls in the next congressional elections, so presidents have frequently had to contend with congressional majorities led by the opposition. The BBC correspondent Alistair Cook observed that British ambassadors to the United States were invariably puzzled about why there was no question period, where Congress could quiz presidents on current policies the way the House of Commons questions prime ministers. Cook explained to them that while separation of the branches prevented this, Congress had the advantage of being able to call the president's cabinet for scrutiny before its committees. He argued that the questions and guffaws that prime ministers and cabinet officers faced in the British House of Commons could not be compared, as a form of executive torture, to an all-day inquisition by a standing committee of Congress. Without the support of a parliamentary majority, the prime minister's government falls. But congressional majorities can ignore the president's legislative proposals, reject his budget, refuse to confirm his nominees, and decline to approve treaties his administration has negotiated. Party discipline in Congress has ebbed and flowed over time, and has varied between House and Senate, but until recently it has rarely been as strong as in a parliamentary system. Leaders seek to mold their party conference into a coherent team, but senators and representatives hold themselves accountable first and foremost to their constituents. Party leaders have trouble retaliating against dissidents whose votes they will be courting on the next issue. The majority leader may need to appeal to members of the opposition to win a vote. Conversely, congressional leaders rarely need worry about third parties or forge coalitions to govern, as happens in parliamentary systems, since none of the states practice proportional representation to help smaller parties gain seats in Congress. Even the physical setting differs. Unlike most parliaments, where the major parties hector each other while directly facing each other, the semicircular seating in the House and Senate chambers facilitates, at times, bipartisan alliances. Other democracies overwhelmingly prefer a parliamentary system. The U.S. Congress, by contrast, is slower, more cumbersome, and less efficient. But that was what the framers of the Constitution intended. They designed a system to resist hasty action and temper any sudden shifts in public opinion, to prevent undue concentration of power, to protect citizens' rights, and to forge a national consensus on demanding issues. all laws necessary and proper. The Constitution assigns all legislative powers to the Congress, together with a long list of specific responsibilities and prohibitions. It implies even more extensive powers by authorizing Congress to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Article 1, Section 8. Known as the Elastic Clause, this provision enables Congress to sketch its control over a myriad of new issues without the need for many new constitutional amendments. Congress has the power of the purse, the sole right to appropriate funds for all federal spending and the burden of raising revenue to pay for it. The Constitution's Commerce Clause gives Congress authority to regulate commerce between the states and between the United States and other nations. Article 1, Section 8. Laws setting minimum wages and maximum hours of work in the 1930s came about under the Commerce Clause, as did the outlawing of racial segregation in the 1960s. Congress has the power to set up the federal court system and set the number of justices on the Supreme Court. It can coin money and borrow it, authorize post offices, build post roads, regulate immigration, and write laws for bankruptcy and copyright. Article 1, Section 8. By two-thirds majorities, Congress can send constitutional amendments to the states for approval. Article 5. Although the Constitution designated these powers expressly to Congress, James Madison warned that it would be impossible to limit the federal government to the exercise of just the expressed powers. There must also be powers by implication, he counseled, unless the Constitution descended to recount every minutiae. The Constitution left congressional influence over foreign and military policy particularly ambiguous. Congress has the authority to raise an army and a navy, fund the national defense, and declare war. Article 1, Section 8. Though modern presidents have made expansive claims of authority under their title as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Services. Article 2, Section 2. The nation has repeatedly gone into combat without formal declarations of war. Instead, presidents ask Congress to pass an authorization for use of military force. War-making powers have become the greatest area of contention between the branches of the government. Contrary to ordinary flowcharts designed to show how a bill becomes law, legislation often follows a convoluted path through Congress. Many initiatives are bundled into enormous legislative packages, a tactic that requires supporters and opponents to swallow more than they might otherwise. Bundling further heightens tension between the Congress and the President, who must sign or veto these omnibus bills. By the time most bills reach the President's desk, they have acquired so much support that it is hard to reject them without suffering adverse political consequences. Buffeted by opposing factions, lawmakers constantly make difficult choices. No single member can push a major bill through Congress unchanged, nor can presidents expect to get everything they want, except under dire circumstances. At the depth of the Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt submitted an emergency banking bill that the House passed that same morning, the Senate passed that afternoon, and Roosevelt signed that evening. No one in Congress had time to read the entire bill. They voted it into law out of desperation, and fortunately it worked to restore public confidence in the banking system. In a similar rush, within a week after the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act, H.R. 3162, knowing that the public expected a speedy bipartisan response. After some time had elapsed, however, there were those who wished that Congress had given more consideration to its provisions affecting civil liberties. Most bills take much longer, since they must leap hurdles in two houses that are widely disparate in structure, procedure, and discipline. The People's House. At each meeting of the House of Representatives, its sergeant-at-arms carries into the chamber the House Mace, a 40-inch silver shaft topped by an American eagle, a design derived from ancient Rome via the British Parliament. The mace is placed on a pedestal beside the Speaker's rostrum to indicate that the House is in regular session. When the House acts as a committee of the whole to relax its rules and expedite business, the mace is set on a lower pedestal to indicate the shift. If tempers flare and disturbances erupt, the sergeant-at-arms restores order by lifting the mace high, as a symbol of the dignity of the House. The House now consists of 435 representatives, a resident commissioner from the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, and 5 delegates from the Territories and District of Columbia. Delegates can vote in the committees but not on the House floor. Like most state legislatures, representatives vote by an electronic voting system, inserting a card into one of the 46 voting boxes throughout the chamber and pressing yes, no, or present. An illuminated scoreboard above the gallery shows a green light for those who voted aye, red for nay, and amber for present. Over the side entrances, electronic tallies indicate the number of votes cast for and against the bill and the amount of time left to vote. Members stream in and mill about the floor in animated knots, cheering on their side's vote count. Even during debate, the House seems to be in constant movement. Members rise to deliver short, often sharp, speeches from podiums in the well at the front of the chamber, while the bill's managers sit at tables equipped with microphones to enable them to be heard above the hubbub. In search of democracy in America, the French political observer Alexis de Tocqueville visited the House in 1832, and he was appalled by the coarse nature of its debate. He assumed that the House represented the lower classes. In the Senate gallery, he listened to dignified orations delivered to attentive members, and he decided this was the American aristocracy. Missouri's Thomas Hart Benton, who served in both the Senate and the House, rebutted this interpretation by pointing out that since many senators had previously served in the House, the two bodies did not represent different classes. The larger House has always been louder and busier, more efficient, and more acrimonious than the smaller Senate. The House evolved into a compound of groups, party conferences, committees, issue caucuses, state delegations, freshman classes, prayer breakfasts, and any other means of creating strength through numbers. The House's three-tiered rostrum aptly symbolizes the structure of the body, from the mass at the bottom to the Speaker at the top. The Speaker began as a neutral presiding officer, modeled after the Speaker in the House of Commons. Once the dynamic, ambitious Henry Clay of Kentucky became Speaker in 1811, however, he made the position more political, so that the Speaker is also leader of the majority party. Using the party conference and behind-the-scenes efforts, the Speaker exerts leadership without voting, and usually without participating in floor debates. To provide a spokesman for the Speaker and the majority party on the floor, the position of Majority Leader evolved, at first appointed by the Speaker and later elected by the Majority Conference. The Speaker relies on the Majority Leader to prepare the weekly schedule of business for the chamber, calling up bills to debate and vote. In the era of industrialism that followed the Civil War, the House modernized its committee and floor procedures to deal with the increasingly complicated economic and social issues it faced. These issues prompted more orderly rules and division of labor within the committee system. As members began to stay in office longer and make careers out of their congressional service, seniority became the standard path to gaining influence and chairing committees. Political scientists have called this development the institutionalization of Congress. In 1880, the House created a new standing committee on rules, which became critical to the Speaker's power. Since then, whenever a controversial bill is called up, the Rules Committee will define the length of debate and the type of amendments that can be offered on the floor. This allows the Speaker and the Majority Leader to know essentially what the bill will consist of and when the vote will occur. Late 19th century speakers chaired the Rules Committee and used it to tame an unruly House. During the Progressive era, Speaker Joseph G. Cannon, Republican, Illinois, single-handedly thwarted reform initiatives. The cigar-chomping Uncle Joe Cannon's dictatorial style eventually sparked rebellion by reformers, who in 1910 forced a vote to remove the Speaker from the Rules Committee. Chairs of the Rules Committee then became independent powers who often strayed from their party's agenda. By 1961, when a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans ran the Rules Committee, liberals sought to reverse the earlier reforms. Speaker Sam Rayburn lent his immense personal prestige to an effort that expanded the membership of the Rules Committee and diluted the power of its chair. Speakers no longer chaired the committee, but they appointed the majority members, turning it into an agent of the leadership. In the 1970s, liberal reformers in the Democratic Conference stripped the House Ways and Means Committee of its authority to appoint members to committees, shifting that power to the party's steering committees under the control of the party leaders. Speaker Jim Wright, Democrat, Texas, further consolidated the power of the leadership until he was brought down on ethics charges raised by Newt Gingrich, Republican, Georgia, leader of the conservative wing of the minority party. When Republicans returned to the majority in 1995 after 40 years in the minority, Speaker Gingrich embraced and expanded Wright's lead in centralizing power under his own control. House Republicans set term limits for committee chairs and gave the Speaker authority to pass over the senior members of his party and pick more like-minded members as chairs. 90 years after Representative Jeanette Rankin, Republican, Montana, became the first woman to serve in Congress, Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, California, broke the marble ceiling to become Speaker in 2007. Although the opposite of Gingrich ideologically, she continued his centralized tendencies. Speaker Pelosi became the face and voice of her party, frequently addressing issues on the House floor. She overruled committee chairs in bringing controversial legislation directly to the floor without their committee's approval. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, Democrat, Nevada, observed with admiration, "She runs the House with an iron hand." Majority parties often have to contend with internal factions that resist following the leadership and promote alternative agendas. Firebrands view their party leaders as an old guard, grown too accustomed to horse trading. Balancing the demands of progressives and moderates complicated legislative strategy for liberal Democratic leaders, while conservative Republicans had to cope with their more zealous Freedom Caucus members. These groups can hold the balance of power, threatening to defect and withhold their votes to force changes in their party's plans. On any given day, 16 of my members decide they're going to go this way, and all of a sudden I have nothing. Speaker John Boehner, Republican, Ohio, lamented his thin majority in 2014. They didn't want legislative victories, he concluded. They wanted wedge issues and conspiracies and crusades. To them, my talk of trying to get anything done made me a sellout. House minority leadership operates at a disadvantage, since the rules favor those who have the votes. The House majority can prevail without bothering to consult the minority. The minority leader focuses instead on positioning the minority to provoke the opposition and appeal to the voters. The job of the minority is largely to keep the majority honest, presenting legislative alternatives that have little chance of passing but that might attract media attention. The minority will try to force votes, despite their limited ability to offer amendments on the floor. One tactic available to them has been a motion to recommend a bill to committee. Since a motion to recommit can be amended, the minority will use it as a vehicle for an amendment that appeals to public opinion, but which the majority party does not want to pass. Once the majority votes it down, the minority has a campaign issue. Representatives take pride in calling themselves the People's House, as that body is the only part of the federal government that has always been directly elected. No one can be appointed to the House. If a representative dies or resigns, the states hold special elections to fill vacancies, unlike Senate vacancies where most governors can make short-term appointments. Every member of the House stands for election every 2 years and takes the oath of office anew at the beginning of the new Congress. By starting fresh, the majority can revise the House rules by a majority vote at the start of the Congress, and it can make significant changes in procedure, particularly if a new majority has just come to power, eager to reverse the way.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?